On Tuesday, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo signed broad legislation expanding access to abortion in his state, and he did it on the 46th anniversary of the Roe v. Wade decision, with the actual lawyer who argued the case before the Supreme Court at his side, Sarah Weddington. She was 27 years old at the time. As far as the content of the new law, it takes abortion out of the state's criminal code entirely, now regulating the issue as a matter of public health, which means that previous law that criminally banned acts that harm a fetus in utero and banned abortions after 24 weeks except if the mother's life is at stake is now out the window. It expands the pool of people who can legally perform abortions to include non-physicians. It allows abortions up to point of birth if the fetus is non-viable or the mother's health is at risk. And that's not just the mother's life at risk, mind you, that's the mother's health. It's a much looser term that assuredly will be interpreted much more loosely. The law also removes existing protections for babies that survive an abortion procedure, meaning medical professionals no longer have an obligation to care for a child that survives the process, at least as far as New York State is concerned. And predictably, this new law is given a nice, wholesome title. It's the Reproductive Health Act, as though we're talking about taking your vitamins and drinking plenty of water during your pregnancy. And this new law has been heavily discussed this week, with critics seeing it as yet another sign of our decaying moral integrity. There's even a push to get Governor Cuomo excommunicated from the Catholic Church over his betrayal of their values. As far as my take, if you've been watching me for a while, you know that I'm a recovering former firmly pro-choice filthy lefty, nudged an inch or two over with each episode of some shout your abortion lady telling me that an abortion is nothing more than ordering fast food or visiting the dentist.
But abortion shouldn't be a luxury. It should be on the dollar menu at McDonald's. Hey, I'd like a large Diet Coke, and can you get this egg out of my McMuffin?
And then they just suck the pregnancy out. And it was like a crappy dentist appointment or something. Then it was over, and I felt really just grateful that I wasn't pregnant anymore.
And even though we're supposed to treat this as routine and mundane, we're also supposed to celebrate it as some kind of achievement too.
Abortion, I salute you! Women, if you need an abortion, get one!
There's nothing like philosophical alignment with that type of degeneracy to get the gears of introspection spinning in your head, and over the last couple years, I've done exactly that. Truth be told, it wasn't just running far, far away from the Michelle Wolfs of the world that's behind my intellectual shift. There was a simple, solid case made by former Libertarian presidential and Senate candidate Austin Peterson on Dave Rubin's show 2 summers ago, and it really sticks in my head.
The question in my mind is it a life? Is it a human life? I think the answer to that question is yes. And then it gets down to the question of, well, when does life begin? Well, can I be intellectually honest and say I don't know because I'm not a scientist and that I don't know everything? But if I'm to make a mistake, I would probably think it would be the moral question is, should you err on the side of life? So I think that, yes, we should err on the side of life.
And when I considered what he said, I really didn't have a great refutation. If there's a human life at stake at some point in this process, even if we can't say exactly when that life begins, it's probably prudent to protect that life amid any doubt. That's if you grant that there is, in fact, a life at stake at some point in this process. But if I don't grant that, then I'm firmly with old kazoo voice Michelle, and I can't hang out with her. I'll lose my mind. So that deals with the moral question to me. That tells me what a moral person would and should do in such a circumstance. The legal question still eludes me a bit, but if we grant that there is, in fact, a life at stake in this process, I have no qualms with people who view it as the state's role to protect it. Protecting life is a fundamental, foundational role for government as we've conceived it, and I don't think it makes you some big government hypocrite to think that protection ought to extend to the unborn. So I'm sympathetic to that broad legal concept. I'm still undecided on some specific exceptions and who ought to be punished, those sorts of questions. But there's a secondary conclusion to which Austin's case leads me, where there's ambiguity, and to the extent I'm not certain how I would write an abortion law myself, I probably shouldn't be writing it for you either, and neither should Washington, D.C. generally, but certainly not 9 unelected, unaccountable justices sitting on the Supreme Court bench. And that's what makes Roe v. Wade such a terrible decision. Even beyond the moral and the life issues, it simply invents and inserts a right to privacy into the 14th Amendment where no such right exists. And even if it did, it's unclear why a privacy right would protect the ending of a life. If I'm charged with murder, can I plead privacy so long as I did it discreetly in my own home with the blinds closed? It's not a privacy question. It's a question of whether there's an individual life with individual rights at stake. And since the Constitution doesn't have anything to say about that, I believe unequivocally that abortion and its regulation is a states' rights issue. Roe is always framed as protecting the right to choose, but it can just as accurately be framed as removing the right to choose, at least from the perspective of the states where I believe the issue ought to remain. If Brett Kavanaugh finally reveals himself as the anti-progressive Lucifer that the prophecy foretold and Roe gets overturned tomorrow, it doesn't make abortion magically and suddenly illegal. It just means the decision gets returned to the states where it belongs, since the federal Constitution doesn't say anything about it. And this is where we finally return to Cuomo and other officials at this bill signing event, because the understated part of their abortion rhetoric is just how much they want to muddle and confuse the constitutional issue here, and what happens if their great fear of Roe being overturned is actually realized. In his press release about the bill signing, Cuomo says, quote, "With the signing of this bill, we are sending a clear message that whatever happens in Washington, women in New York will always have the fundamental right to control their own body." And the lieutenant governor adds, quote, "We act today on the anniversary of the groundbreaking decision of Roe versus Wade and recognize the threat we face from a Supreme Court determined to overturn protections that have been in place for over 4 decades. And several media outlets parroted this line. Cuomo protects access to abortion in New York, even if Roe versus Wade is overturned. Yeah, but that's the point though. If Roe v. Wade gets overturned, you can do whatever you want on the issue. The result of overturning is not abortion becomes illegal. The result is no regulation at all, and you get to decide in your state what that regulation ought to be, if any, just like you're doing right now at this very bill signing event. Throughout his speech, Cuomo's doublethink like this gets really frustrating to follow. He simultaneously praises the federal control of the Roe versus Wade decision, even giving that lawyer an award for her public service in removing this issue from the states.
For your success winning the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade decision and your lifelong commitment to equality, freedom, and individual rights for all.
Yet in the same brief speech, he rips the president and the Supreme Court and other officials for supposed federal overreach on this issue.
This president and these extremists are going there. Do not kid yourself. Today's decision on the military ban for transgender, that 5-4, you're going to hear that over and over and over again. That's why they wanted the Supreme Court.
And he says officials in New York have to take bold steps to protect their state and handle this issue for themselves.
And that's why we had to pass this law to protect our state. And that's why I believe we have to go even a step further and do a constitutional amendment so no governor, no legislator, no political swing can ever jeopardize a woman's right to control her own body in this state.
So just to be clear, when it's an idea that Andrew Cuomo likes, well then, top-down federal control is the way to go, clearly. But when it's an idea he doesn't like, well then clearly it's a state's issue, so that his state isn't subject to federal overreach, even when that supposed overreach is actually the federal government giving his state more control over itself. He's standing firmly behind a top-down anti-states' rights decision in Roe versus Wade as a way to argue for his state's right to govern itself free from federal intrusion, and I'm supposed to accept this argument as coherent. Disagree with his new law as I may, I actually agree with the idea that Andrew Cuomo and the people of his state ought to be able to govern their own affairs to the maximum possible extent, but I wish I could ask him why he doesn't extend that same courtesy to me. If he disagrees with me or my state or the federal government on how to handle the issue, well then it's hands off. Stay out of it in New York. But if I disagree with his law and say I don't want it here in Montana, Cuomo says tough, federal precedent ties your hands, and that's a good thing. I wish I could attribute his perspective to stupidity or ignorance, but it's not that. The guy's a lawyer, he knows Roe versus Wade, and he knows that overturning it would not in fact be a burden to the states. It would actually free them and return power to their hands. So it's not that the guy's an idiot, it's just that he wants control, which is hugely ironic considering this whole spectacle article is supposedly about empowering people to make decisions for themselves. And that's the understated part of the abortion debate to me. These are complex decisions to make. And amid the moral debate about what to decide, let's not lose focus on who should decide. If the Constitution is silent on the issue, should you get to decide with your neighbors what the law should say in your state? Or should some central control in DC decide that for you? For all the talk of promoting choice, it seems to be the one choice that Andrew Cuomo apparently opposes. Each locality and state's choice to govern itself as it sees fit. Unless it's his state, of course, in which case all of us need to mind our own business. And then he'll be by later to make sure we're conducting our business correctly. It's control for me, but not for thee. Be wary of these contradictory, incoherent arguments. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel always. Appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below and especially over on Twitter, that is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Okay, bye.